fully fall day. Good to see you. This is not the event about birth control, which will be a very lively one. I'm Mark Massa, by the way. I'm calling this, they're taking Mark to the woodshed event. So, tonight we're rather talking about being Jewish in the age of Donald Trump. We have an all-star cast here, as you probably already recognize. So I thought the way we would do this is just have I'm going to ask them a series of questions. They will answer them or not as they see fit. These are all my friends, so I know how they do this. And then I'll open it up the conversation to all of you. So please feel free. It's sort of an informal event. And Boisi does it this way, and I love it this way. Okay. Susannah Heschel to my immediate left is the Eli Black Professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College. Her scholarship has focused on Jewish-Christian relations in Germany in the 19th and 20th centuries, and she is the author of numerous publications, including Abraham Geiger and the Jewish Jesus, which won the National Jewish Book Award. She is currently working on a history of European Jewish scholarship on Islam. Do I have that right? Okay, great. To her left is Professor Ruth, one of my colleagues in the theology department here at BC. She is a professor of Jewish studies and associate director of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning. Her scholarship focuses on Jewish liturgy and ritual and on Jewish-Christian relations. She is also the author of numerous publications, most recently of a book entitled Jewish Liturgy, a Guide for Research. And it's a guide, is this right, up to over 1,000?
It's an annotated bibliography.
Well, how cool is that? Okay. And to her left is Mark Silk, who is the director of the Leonard Greenberg Center for the Study of Religion in Public Life at Trinity College in Hartford. He is the founding editor of Religion in the News, a magazine published by his center that examines how the news media handles religious topics. At the risk of repeating myself, he too is the author of numerous publications, including Unsecular Media, News of Religion in America. Please join me in welcoming these three. So I want to begin by just asking you some questions, and it can be in any order you want. First, I want to ask you, with the election of Donald Trump to the presidency in 2016, do you think there has been an increased visibility of anti-Semitic language and violence in the United States? And if so, why? And what do you think is the relation between that election and if there is a spike in anti-Semitism, the spike in anti-Semitism?
Well, not only in the United States, it's been all over the world. And yes, I do think that it was latent, but he has made it in some way, quote unquote, respectable. He makes a wink, he winks at people. He used certain images in his campaign that were anti-Semitic images. Those who are scholars recognize it, and those who are what are called neo-Nazis also recognize it. The idea that the Ku Klux Klan not only still exists, but is given some kind of legitimacy is horrifying to me. I would also just say that it's not only anti-Semitism, but it's this mixture in this ugly, horrible pot of anti-Semitism, racism, misogyny, anti-immigrant. He is also more than simply the images and the language and the winking from a president, the vulgarity, the absence of dignity, basic human dignity. But it's also the passion that he arouses at these rallies. That frightens me. This is not some cool, collected, I can mention Heinrich von Treitschke in 1879 in Germany making a dispassionate argument against Jews. That's one thing. But this, I must say what he's doing is terrifying to me. And my father was living in Germany from 1929 until 1938. And from what he described to me, this is unbelievable that this is happening to me. It's frightening, and it brings back some terrible thoughts.
So you would make an explicit analogy between what's happening now and
Absolutely.
in Germany?
Yes, I would, and I would recommend everybody an excellent article by Christopher Browning, very distinguished scholar of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, that just appeared in the New York Review of Books, where he spells it out very clearly.
Good.
Didn't leave a whole lot to be said.
Now Ruth is going to take issue with this.
No, I'm not. But I think that, on a day-to-day basis, I'm not sure that American Jews are necessarily feeling the anti-Semitism personally, although the Anti-Defamation League, which notes every single incident of anti-Semitism, has noted significant upticks. I didn't dig in deep enough into their statistics to know, it's double, but whether they were including in that count the significant number of incidents that came up just after Trump was inaugurated, which turned out to have been perpetrated by an Israeli kid, that becomes complicated. But the very fact that this kind of discourse is become okay, that it's okay to say impolite, rude things about other people, that our whole social level of interaction with other people is problematic. Germany this weekend, there was a huge rally in Berlin on Saturday with, they estimate, about 200,000 people present. But the formal speakers included people who were calling for the dissolution of the State of Israel. And that was, and going back to a pre-1948, before the state existed, that is, in the context of Jews listening to this, for most Jews, that is anti-Semitism. Now, this is in the context of a Germany that has done an immense, huge amount to confront its heritage of anti-Semitism. I can only applaud what's done in German schools today, what the educational process is for kids growing up, to own the Holocaust, to confront it, and yet the number of different groups in contemporary Germany who are coming up on the fringes where this is coming out of the woodwork is part of this global phenomenon of lack of tolerance for the other, of which anti-Semitism becomes the one that hits home. It becomes important, but I think that that's part of a larger context.
Well, I'll dissent in part. I think both of my colleagues are absolutely right when it comes to circumstances abroad, and particularly in Europe. I think the problems which I, happily concede with the Trump administration and Trump rhetoric, with respect to minorities, with respect to immigrants, is just as bad. I wouldn't disagree with what Susannah said at all. I don't think anti-Semitism is a significant element. I understand the ADL statistics, but this is a Republican Party that is as enthusiastic about Israel as any American party has ever been. Whether it's the Israel we would want is another question. I think whatever one says about the religious right, about white evangelicals, they are not notably anti-Semitic, to the contrary. And so I think we're living in a somewhat confused world as far as American Jewry is concerned, in which there has been some revival of traditional right-wing anti-Semitism, but to a modest degree, and where the Jewish community as a whole, rightly or wrongly, something we can talk about, have been almost exclusively focused on what is taken to be left-wing anti-Zionism / anti-Semitism, and sort of dealing with those two realities has been, I think, an interesting and problematic challenge.
I want to ask a question about how the current political climate has affected the internal discussions within the American Jewish community. Has the admitted confused social moment that we're in, and confusing on a lot of levels, has it contributed to an increased divisiveness within the American Jewish community itself?
You know, can I respond to something that Mark just said?
Okay. And then a fight broke out at 6:45.
I've heard this discussion about Christian evangelicals, and I've heard arguments on both sides. I don't agree with you. And the reason I don't agree is that, to me, the most important thing for a Jew to feel safe is democracy in this country. And I see the Christian evangelical movement as an anti-democratic movement. And so that's number one. Number two, today you may have seen in the New York Times an article about racism in Charlottesville, Virginia, in the school system. I'm actually going there to give a lecture in 2 weeks, a lecture on anti-Semitism to the Jefferson Society at the university. And I read that article with a lot of interest. And I tell you, if there is this kind of racism against African Americans, there is going to be anti-Semitism. Where you find racism, you find anti-Semitism. The two go hand in hand, and you can't resolve one without the other. So to me, I'm sure one could come up with a lovely metaphor of a disease that carries within it some other kind of disease, something like that. But the two are inextricably bound because it's a matter of thinking, how you think about human beings and what your commitments are to the rights of a person, to the human rights, to human dignity. And I don't see it in the evangelical community.
Susannah's running for president of the United States. No. So thank you. So what do you think? No. Do you think there has been an increased divisiveness within the American Jew, or is it causative or not?
There's always divisiveness in the Jewish community. That's the first thing to know, is that Jews like to disagree with each other.
So like Catholics.
Well, no, I mean, Catholics, when they disagree with each other, my experience having spent getting close to 25 years here, is that they're very polite about it. And the idea of publicly criticizing somebody or even is just something that's not done. Whereas the Jewish culture that I came from to come to BC was one when you went to a public event, you whispered in the ear of your neighbor, all the snide things that came up in your mind. So there's something about Jewish culture that, having a good rousing argument is really intrinsic and important to Jewish culture. And it's something that is done without personal animosity. It's just how we think together. So that's the first thing that needs to be said. That said, yes, there is a lot of divisiveness that's coming up around contemporary events that I've seen. And for instance, and I brought along an example on this, which is that the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is reformed. So this is the left end of the Jewish community, more or less. Put out a response to Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation, in which it began, "Dear members, we, along with many of you and many of your communities, are devastated by the Senate's vote to confirm Brett Kavanaugh in the Supreme Court. We share the pain and frustration of many of the Senate's decision, as well as the deep division and anger this debate has inflamed across our country." And it goes on from there, and then calls for healing. The response to this that I saw was, how dare the executive board of the Central Conference of American Rabbis try to speak for me as somebody who is in pain and upset about this confirmation. And the language that was used was not friendly and it was not nice. So over every single issue, there's that kind of divisiveness coming up, even within individual movements, which is our word for denominations, and all the more so between the different movements, where some of the fundamental values are very, very different on things like abortion and so on and so forth.
I agree, but it's, in a way what you're saying is it's the Bible. I mean, the difference between Jeremiah and Amos attacking the kings, attacking the people, on your shirt is found the blood of the innocent. That's a strong statement from Jeremiah, and Jesus is much more gentle. It doesn't have that kind of prophetic passion, let's say. So that would be one example of it.
I think we should say that, one of the things I do is follow some of the Catholic debates over Pope Francis, and I'm not sure it's very polite, actually.
Yeah, it's a little
So, just to talk about the Judeo-Christian tradition here of cut and thrust.
I'm talking about the Jesuit Catholic tradition.
Well, we know where the
And we're
Jesuits, we know where the
nothing
Jesuits stand. But I'll tell a personal story, which I think in some ways is more, points to the dangers, and not only for the Jewish community. My synagogue sponsored a teach-in on the separation of children and parents from at the border. That was for a while policy of the current administration.
Still is.
And still is. So I went to it, and the daughter of the rabbi was sitting behind me and said, there are a lot of co-sponsors here, ADL of Connecticut and all the big synagogues and Jewish Family Services and so on, but not Federation and not the JCRC, not the Community Relations Council, which I'm on the advisory board. I was surprised. So I thought, in my capacity as editorial writer for our Connecticut Jewish Ledger, I would poke into that. I try not to drag the story out too long, but it turned out that the Federation in Greater Hartford had issued a very strong statement on the separation of children and parents, and gotten vilely attacked by some people in emails that the president had received.
The president of the Federation.
Of the Federation. And so when it came around to this teach-in, they decided they weren't going to do that. And in fact, so I went to the people who were sort of in charge of these things and asked them, what was going on. And they said, well, there are no issues that we can take stands on anymore. We're going to turn to talk about, we have to talk about civil discourse. So we're going to sponsor those things. So I went to the owner of the paper and I said, Henry, I think we should do an editorial about this, because if this means that the umbrella organizations of the Jewish community are not going to be able to issue statements, this is a bad thing. Can we do an editorial? Because he's the biggest donor in the greater Hartford area. And he said, okay, go for it. So I wrote an editorial. He ran it by the president of the Federation, who didn't like it. It was killed. I resigned from the board.
Wow.
And that's the quick version of the story. But the point is, this is what I fear more than anything else, which is the silencing of voices in the face of moral outrage. That because of these divisions, and you can see this in the Greek Orthodox Church, where the Clergy Laity Council, which sort of runs the place, divided between bishops who wanted to condemn this separation and lay people who spoke out against it. You find it in
U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops.
Well, you find it in a lot of places. And my concern here is the silencing of moral voices. Not that there haven't been some, but that this is what is happening in these divided communities, where in most of these communities where you've got people on different sides of issues, the bureaucratic response is to say, well, we're not going to go there.
So let me press you a little bit on, because this is very interesting. So what sorts of, is there a specific kind of voice that's silenced? Is there a specific wing of voice that's silenced, or is it just voices generally across the spectrum are silenced?
Well, I think what I was concerned about in this case was that the overall umbrella organization, which speaks for the community as a whole, decides it can't speak because and this isn't the only issue, but that's what on Israel, on any policies, and of course, where you have an administration where some of the policies are just egregious. I mean, how anybody in the Jewish community cannot protest the separation of children and of immigrants and their parents at the border is sort of beyond me. But that's attacking our president, and if you support the president at this point, that becomes impossible. And but there are plenty of voices. It's not that there aren't voices, it's that speaking collectively, communally, is a problem.
And I would say that extends to the pulpit being silenced. So the rabbi of our congregation, I have not heard him speak out explicitly on any of these sorts of issues. Occasionally, there's something very, very oblique. And he's a wonderful person in a lot of ways. I'm sure he has feelings, but he doesn't let it show. And the community has a listserv, which is a source of all sorts of good information. You posted the other day. But it's not allowed to post anything political on
Because if you do,
it.
there will be outrage and people will be at each other's throats.
Have you, is this something new?
So where does the discussion happen? It happens around dinner tables. And I would say, and that is.
It happens over Rosh Hashanah dinners, as Susannah Heschel.
Well, and, you know, from the moment that Trump was elected, we were in Israel that year, but from the moment Trump was elected, it was the only topic at every meal table and it's only just begun to die down that we've had like one or two without him being
Do you think
named.
this is new? Do you think this is something sort of like qualitatively new, this kind of silencing of voices? Or do you think we've been here before in the civil rights movement or anything like that?
I don't remember the civil rights movement.
I'm dating myself. So.
Yeah.
What would you say?
Well, I think look, it is in the nature of pulpit clergy to not want to divide congregations or I think what we have hoped, and this was true in the civil rights movement, was that policy issues cut across partisan lines, and sometimes the moral issue is so clear that, you know, if you stood up for civil rights, at least in the North, you know, you had congregations that were together on that issue. I think the degree to which all issues now become, or every issue, maybe the murder of Khashoggi is you know, a bipartisan concern, but where so many of the issues in the country are construed as partisan issues and therefore divide people, I think it makes it very difficult.
Do you agree?
During the civil rights era, yes, there were congregations, especially in the South, but not only synagogues, churches as well, that resented the civil rights movement and felt that it endangered the local white community. I read a memoir by a rabbi in Montgomery, Alabama, whose synagogue was a few blocks from Dr. King's church, and Dr. King wanted to study Hebrew with him. And the rabbi was delighted, but the congregation did not want Dr. King to come in through the front door of the church, but through the back door, the delivery door. The rabbi eventually quit to the delight of the congregation and so forth. So there was, but I don't think there was the same kind of tension in those days with congregations and with Jewish communities, because there was a sense of pride, a sense that we are, as Jews, are doing something for another community, putting ourselves on the line. And a lot of young Jews, and a lot of rabbis. Rabbi Lelyveld was beaten bloody. Rabbi Cy Dresner, he was the most arrested rabbi in America because he, you know. And I think there was some pride, but I also would say that the pride came with a price. That is, the civil rights work was also defined in a way that made it very bland. And it was accompanied by a backlash around affirmative action, for example. What's happening today, I would say, are two issues. One is a prosperity gospel that's infected the Jewish world. People want wealth. And I don't mean it in the sense of the prosperity gospel of the ministers with the, you know, the movement of New Thought of the 19th century, that if you give the minister money, you'll get a shower of blessings. Yeah? Not like that, but just the idea that wealth is the goal. And I contrast this to Europe, where it didn't matter if you were a wealthy Jew in Vienna, the Aphrusi family with their banking family. What did they want? They wanted to associate it with musicians and writers and philosophers. Or if you were in a little village in Berdichev, the Woodchoppers' Society for the Study of Torah was stamped in a book. You could be most impoverished, but you wanted to learn, to study, to associate with intellectuals. That was the goal. What do we have in America? What do you have in a house? People have a bar, they don't have bookcases. I lived in Dallas, I used to see that, I couldn't believe it. Anyway, so there's a prosperity gospel is one thing, that it has really
We
destroyed
could
the
have an
whole
interesting
world.
conversation whether Dallas is part of America, but that's a different thing.
But the other issue is
I think you mean
Israel.
prosperity Torah.
And there is a way in which everything becomes then what is the best thing for Israel. And that's where we see the role of rumor and gossip. Because a lot of Jews loathed President Obama on the grounds that he allegedly was anti-Israel, which he wasn't. And all kinds of rumors were spread against him and hostility toward him, which I think was also very racist. And so now they make a compromise. You cannot compromise with your conscience. But the compromise is, yeah, we'll be silent on ripping children, babies, from their parents' arms because he's good for Israel. What does good for Israel mean? That's another story. But that's the price. How do you compromise on your conscience? What's left? Once you make a compromise with your conscience, it's no longer a conscience. And how will history judge us, of course, but how are we judged today? What, are you telling me that the Catholic bishops wouldn't speak out about what's being done to these immigrants? How can that be? Are we just going to throw our conscience in a muddy hole and walk away? What is this?
Ruth, do you want to say
Yeah, maybe sort of past time, but I had, in terms of civil rights, I didn't encounter it personally because I was too little, but my first student congregation when I was in rabbinic school was in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, which is a university town, obviously in Mississippi, but New South in the sense that it's not a city that had a deep, deep history going back to pre-Civil War days. But they had a rabbi in the 60s who came from the north and got very involved in the civil rights movement. And in the 20 years later, they still wouldn't talk about it. I tried to ask questions of people who had known him, even been friends with him, and this was not a matter of discussion. This was a community that was basically merchants. They ran the local department stores and things like that. And they felt that this involvement in this issue was hurting their bottom line. And I mean, that is my interpretation. And so they could not get involved, and this guy from outside was coming in and threatening them, and it's not directly, but indirectly. So it's all, I mean, that's just to illustrate what Susannah was saying.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a complicated story, and you know, I'm sympathetic to clergy dealing with congregations, but you know, there was a case of Jacob Rothschild in Atlanta, the temple was bombed. There's a book by a friend of mine, Melissa Green, about the temple bombing, which took place because he was a supporter of the civil rights movement. One of the most extraordinary documents from the civil rights movement that I know, and that I think very few people know, is a sermon given on Rosh Hashanah Eve by the rabbi of the Reform Synagogue in Birmingham a week after the bombing. This rabbi happens to be one of the ones to whom the Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail is directed. He was actually very upset that King brought the movement to Birmingham because he was working hard to try to get rid of Bull Connor. And then there's this bombing. He's involved in trying to help the situation to a maximum degree. He shows up to give his sermon. It's unprepared. He hasn't had time to do it. And it's 45 minutes of free associational rage in all directions, including at his congregation for sitting around lamenting the racism but doing nothing about it. It's fascinating. These are tough issues. I don't think anybody should pretend that it's easy to look a big donor in the face who's a Trump supporter and say, keep your money, we have to do this, even if it, at what cost. We don't have a lot, and there's never been a lot, of heroes in bureaucracies. We would like it to be the case, but I don't think anybody should pretend that these are easy decisions for people who have to meet budgets. And that's why we applaud moral leadership, not because it's easy to be prophets, but because it's hard.
Let me pick up something that Susannah and Mark wrote. The perception among some in the Jewish community that Trump is good for Israel. Now, the obvious thing is that he, in fact, moved the embassy, the former embassy, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Are there other things? How is Trump viewed as being good for Israel, besides the fact that he made good on his promise to move the embassy to Jerusalem?
Well, I think that moving the embassy is a symbolic step which has to do with the promise to recognize Israel as the capital of Israel. And this is recognize Jerusalem, and specifically West Jerusalem, although he didn't specify it as such, as the capital of Israel. And I think that that's more the issue than the embassy itself. The embassy is a symbolic level of that. So there's that aspect. There's the sense that he is perhaps going to actually come up with a peace plan that might do something, although I think one's losing faith in that quickly. I certainly am, as the promise gets not implemented or not even revealed in terms of its details. And you know, and also the real question of what's possible to do. But yeah, so it's based on, it's not based on a lot of details as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
But it is one of the bases for some people, for 25% of the American Jewish community having been voters for Trump, or voters against Hillary, and those are overlapping categories in many ways. And of course, a certain number of American votes that are coming based on that single issue are also the Americans who have the right to vote in America, but who are resident in Israel, dual citizens.
Sam,
He's adored in Israel. And I find that, yeah. No, I think there's been a worldwide, I don't know, a virus in the drinking water or something, but there is a kind of a move to this Trump-like alt-right, whatever you want to call it, neo-fascist leader around the world, and it's terribly frightening. And it's my feeling also about the people running the Israeli government. I can't stand them. But I also just want to point, did you notice that ceremony that they had in Jerusalem? Did you see what happened? That they flew in 2 evangelical pastors to speak, and the first one gets up, and the guy who's had a bad reputation for blaming Jews for the Holocaust, and he's invited to speak in Jerusalem, and he gets up and prays in the name of Jesus Christ. And what? And then, and just to offend those people, yes, and then to add fire to the flame, the 2 very pious chief rabbis of Israel, and whatever problems one may have with them, I respect them and their piety. And then who is brought in? A young woman is brought in with low cut, etc., to sing 2 songs in front of these rabbis who, in their piety, in their tradition, do not listen to the voice of a woman singing.
And do not look at underdressed women.
It was insulting to everyone. And then the same day that they're shooting, Israeli soldiers are shooting demonstrators in Gaza, which is a long-standing conflict that really needs to be resolved, and peace needs to be made. That's where the attention should be, not an embassy, whether it's in, okay. And then the prime minister gets up and said it's a great day for peace. What? What is going on? What is this about? So are we getting somehow hypnotized, mesmerized by something. What is this? I feel as though everybody was taken in. And I'm shocked by this, I'm horrified. And what, should a Jew be happy? What Jew? Certainly not a religious Jew after the chief rabbis are insulted in that way.
Let me pick on something on that then. Has what has happened in the past 2 years, in what way has that complicated the American Jewish community's relationship to the state of Israel?
I mean, if you look at the survey data, there was a significant survey done in June by the American Jewish Committee. So, you know, it gives a pretty good picture comparing Israeli Jewish and American Jewish views on a range of issues. And what you see is a very stark divide on many issues. The Israeli public was extremely enthusiastic about moving the embassy and recognizing Israel's capital. Jews in America were evenly divided. And you can see some that kind of division paralleled on settlements, on peace process, on two-state solution. It's simply true that the Israeli Jewish community is further to the right than the American Jewish community. And one of the things that I would say in answer to your question, you know, is that the Trump administration's policy has tended to push those two communities further apart, because the traditional view, approach of American administrations, you know, not just Obama, but previously, was not to embrace whatever the given Israeli government wanted to do, but to try to be, to some degree, an honest broker, to push Israel in the direction towards peace, to push the Palestinians toward peace, with you know, indifferent success all the way through. But I think what's happened in the current administration is simply, you know, it's not this concrete policy or that concrete policy, but essentially throwing up their hands, as far as one can tell, and saying, whatever you want, Bibi, is okay with us.
I think Mark is very much correct that Trump has torn us apart as Jews, but also many other communities within the United States, and it will take a long time to heal from this terrible division, because it is, as Ruth said, so hostile, so angry.
Ruth, you're gonna
I
say
think,
something?
yeah, no, the other piece which I would put on the table is that what we all pretty naturally do, and I'm thinking collectively as communities, is we put our world, our immediate world is at the center of the global world. So what Americans tend to care about is what's good for America. What Israelis tend to care about is what's good for Israel. And they don't necessarily then pay attention to what's good in America and understand that what's good for America internally might also then eventually be good for Israel. So my daughter is going on 6 years ago or something like that now, but she's now a rabbi. She was studying in Israel for the year. And she was realizing there was a discussion among her cohort there of Israelis saying, you know, why on earth do American Jews support Obama? And she then devised an exercise for them. And she gave them red and blue cards to hold up and said, okay, who among you thinks that the government should be supportive of public education? All the blue cards went up. Who among you think that the government should be supportive of health services? Blue cards, and so on and so forth. And only after they went through this long list of Democratic priorities did she say, do you realize that you guys just voted for a Democrat? So there's not a perception that some of these things that are very, very important to me as an American and to many Americans are things where it doesn't necessarily line up with this perceived best for Israel. And so that all plays into this whole picture in a lot of ways. And that's why I mentioned before, some of the American Jews who voted for Trump were essentially one-issue voters in terms of perceiving what's best for Israel.
You agree, the two of you would agree.
Mhm.
Okay, now.
We're in way too much agreement here.
Yeah.
Well, that'll change right now. Now comes the unfair part of the exercise, okay? I gave a homily, I'm a Catholic priest, and I gave a homily at St. Ignatius, which is an admittedly left-of-center parish down the hill, on 2 Sundays ago, about the bishop. I'm furious at the American bishops. So I got up, I basically scrapped my homily and got up and said, I didn't say the bishops were jerks, but I came very close to it. And I said, and don't you ever forget that you're the church. The bishops aren't the church. I said to the congregation, you're the church. Well, there was applause. I was astonished. I'd never heard it in St. Ignatius. There was applause. So there was applause, but then 3 people came up to me at the door, you know, at the end of the service, and really lit into me, like, how could you say something like that? So there is a cost for this. I mean, even in the context of an overwhelmingly positive response in a left of center congregation, there's a cost. If you are a rabbi, Ruth, so if 3 of you were rabbis, and you were talking to your congregation about this issue, about the current state of the Jewish community in the United States, and you had 2 minutes of undivided attention, and I'm going to time you on this actually, what would you say?
The rabbis never say anything in less than 20 minutes.
Well, it's better than professors.
Yeah. You go first. You're the rabbi.
I would talk about the value that is known in Jewish terms as shalom bayit, of peace in the home, but it's not just the home, it's in the community. And that we have to figure out ways to get to that, to not ignore discourse and ignore differences, but to have a discourse that allows us to put the differences on the table and accept each other in spite of and beyond the differences.
1 minute, 30 seconds, pretty darn good. That's good, okay. Marcus? You're an academic and not a rabbi. Okay, so.
I'm not, but I do write an opinion column, so I guess that makes me I would try to figure out a way to talk about, I mean, to play the game that your daughter played with a congregation. That is, to see where people stand on issues apart from politics, apart from their, so that, I mean, I despair of getting to civil discourse by talking about civil discourse. I think that there are ways in which people can agree on certain things, including maybe health care, and then move from there. But I think that's what I do. I don't know if that's too much.
Well, that's good. Susannah?
So I'm interested in the history of emotions and how emotions are manipulated politically. So I would ask myself, what's going on today? Why do we have so much anger? Why do we have the resentment? I would encourage, I think everybody wants to think independently or believe that they are thinking independently. No one wants to say, yes, I'm being manipulated. So I would want to encourage a congregation or anybody to say, how are you being manipulated here? What really is going on? And to keep in mind something else, which is that anger is often not the primary feeling, but it's used to avoid feeling something else, perhaps vulnerable, let's say. You know, this, yes, of course you need health insurance. Yes, you're healthy today. What if, God forbid, a car hits you tomorrow? Then what are you going to do? So the vulnerability needs to be brought out. And then would be for me the question of, what do you want to stand for? What do you want to be remembered for? What gives you pride in your parents and your grandparents, what they stood for? What do you want your grandchildren to say for you? What are your principles, your moral, write an ethical will for your family, what you want to be remembered for. So I would hope that somehow we can get beneath this politics of resentment, which I think Dan Carter wrote about it in his book, biography of George Wallace. I try to get beneath that and make people also take hold of their own lives and understand they have to think for themselves.
Sort of a Jewish altar call if I've ever heard of. Do you have questions for our yes, sir?
Yes. My name's Peter Scary. I teach in the political science department here. And I would be curious to hear the panelists' response to what I would say is an interesting and surprising development in response, I think, to the Trump administration and his election, which is the rapprochement between American Jews and the American Muslim communities. I wonder if you share that perception, and if you don't, why, and if you agree, how you would explain it.
Well, I think rapprochement might be the wrong word. I don't think that these communities have been at odds particularly. This isn't to say there aren't severe differences of opinions on certain issues. I think it's, but I would also, so I don't know how much things have changed. I think there's some evidence of some coming together, and certainly there has been a shift, a profound shift in the Muslim community in the direction of the Democratic Party, and in that sense there's common cause. But I don't know, I mean, somebody who works in interfaith stuff more than I do, what would you say?
You know, there is a move in many places to talk about what we used to call trialogue. That's a made-up word that many people dismissed at that point. When we first tried it out, we discovered that trialogue is superficial, because finding the specific points of discussion is between 3 different communities at the same time becomes problematic. That any 2 communities can find points of discussion and can take them very deep. There is some Jewish-Muslim dialogue going on, but I don't have the sense that there's a lot of Jewish-Muslim dialogue going on, or that it's at the kind of depth and maturity that Jewish-Christian dialogue
So
has.
you would take issue with Peter's
With
calling
rapprochement, there are some efforts at dialogue, I think that's very true. There are also some individuals and some organizations that are sponsoring Islamophobic propaganda. The Center for American Progress did a study about that a few years ago. And you know what goes on in France, where you can say Muslims come to France angry at Jews because they hate Israel, let's say, or because they come to France and discover, anti-Semitism. That's an easy way to express our anger and resentment. It's a good European mode of being, which is why I said that racism and anti-Semitism go hand in hand. So I think it's multifaceted. I wouldn't say it's just a rapprochement.
So a lot of the international expressions of violence against Jews are coming from these immigrant Muslim communities to England, to France, to a certain extent to Germany, and that's a real issue. There's been less of that in the United States.
Good. Yes, right here. He's going to bring you a mic here, so.
So I'm thinking about the first part of the title of the program, what it means to be Jewish. And I'm just wondering if you think the election of Trump has caused Jews to think more reflectively about what it means to be Jewish, such as welcoming the stranger, repairing the world. And has that actually, in a good way, just like what happened a year ago with the Me Too movement, record numbers of women running for public office. Has this era resulted in Jews being more reflective about the core values of Judaism?
It would be nice to think
Yeah.
so. I don't know. I don't have any evidence of that.
I would the one thing I would say, which is a little bit spinning off of your question rather than answering it directly, is that Trump's rhetoric about retrieving a Christian America was something that I found very scary and off-putting. That, you know, America needs to retrieve its Christian roots. Now, the question is what he meant by that, which isn't so clear.
Not very much, I would say.
From perspective.
When he was asked, he said he went to Marble Collegiate Church and one of the reporters asked him, what Sundays do you like to go? And he said, I like to go on those Sundays when they serve the wine and the cookies. It's like, well, what?
Well, and it was a matter of
Not
being
like
able to
theological
greet people,
expertise, but-
and being able to greet people with Merry Christmas instead of season's greetings. But,
But he was playing to his Christian evangelical base.
Sure, that was silly.
yes, and essentially energizing it and validating it. Whereas, so it has essentially enhanced the Jewish perception, which was never absent, of being minorities within Jewish culture. Now, within American culture. I mean, the other reality in American society is the vast number of American Jews who are married to people who are not Jews, and whose children are marrying people who are not Jews, and not raising their children as Jews.
Yeah, but for example.
So that doesn't,
In our synagogue,
Mhm.
we actually sponsored a couple of refugee families from Syria. And I
Which
think
synagogue?
Temple Beth Elohim in Wellesley.
Oh,
And I think, in a way that Trump's horrific rhetoric has stimulated people to think about the other and welcoming the other, welcoming the strangers. I'm just wondering if there's evidence of that around the communities, around the country.
Well, where I come from, there have been synagogues who have participated in exactly what you're saying. Actually, mainline Protestant churches have to a greater degree. You know, I think there's been, I'm afraid to say that, but that the complicated approach of the Trump administration to, you know, between Israel and one thing and another, has actually not impelled that kind of thing you're talking about. That's not to say that there aren't congregations such as yours that haven't taken that step, but I haven't seen that kind of evidence.
has Temple Beth Elohim gone as far as giving sanctuary to these families?
We've hosted
In the
families-
building?
No.
Okay, because there are
We've raised-
churches where literally
Yeah.
they are giving sanctuary within the building, creating the building as a safe space with people there, with Americans, not immigrants, there accompanying them, and with the understanding that a church operates as a sanctuary space which has some degree of inviolability.
Oh, okay.
So that's why I'm also a little hesitant to, yes, it's very good what Temple Beth Elohim has been doing, but it's not at the same level as what I see in some parts of the Christian world.
Susannah. The gentleman up there.
Hi, I'm Benjamin Brown, I teach in the history department. Good evening to all of you. I have a historical comment which is unfortunately somewhat pessimistic. And it gets beyond simply the elements of the movement of Trump and deals with a larger pattern in American Jewish political and social identity and values. I think a lot of what we assume to be Jewish political values is shaped by the migration from Tsarist Russia in the beginning of the century, before and at the turn of the century, and then reinforced by the phenomenon of the Shoah, which tended to identify the right wing embodied in Tsarist Russia and the right wing embodied in Germany as the enemy, and prompted a movement towards the left. Now, the nature of the immigration to Israel, certainly, and to the United States, has been not as great in terms of the U.S., significant in terms of Israel. The nature of the immigration from Russia is from a different Russia. And it's a Russia which is reacting to the left. It's a Russia which is much more, the Russian immigrants are much different from the Russian immigrants of the turn of the century. There are no
Contemporary
socialists in the new immigrants. And the consequence of that is, in fact, to change, not in an overwhelming degree, but to change somewhat the political valence methods.
Can I just
of
pause it right there?
humanity.
That's an important point. Do you want to just comment about the change in the
Yes, I
nature
think
of
he's making a
immigration?
very important point, and that is certainly the Russian immigration to Israel was very important in bringing in people very well trained in computer science and keeping Israel from being damaged during the economic downturn in 2008, but has also brought in a right-wing politics, and we see with some of the Russian immigrants themselves who have become important in the political sphere. And it's true in the US as well. Russian Jews often will not understand American history and question why we have a civil rights movement, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, they're bringing in a right-wing politics. You're absolutely right, and that has changed. And there are other groups like that as well. I think the Iranian community in Los Angeles has also similarly moved the political nature of the community to the right. So thank you for that point.
I mean, one question that I've had in light of this, Ben, nice to see you, is what the reaction of the Russian immigrant communities, both here and in Israel, has been to having a KGB guy running Russia. Do they like Putin, or do they, see him as essentially part of the apparat that they were running away from? I don't know the answer to that question.
I think they like you.
And they've just forgotten his communist roots.
No, he's transformed himself sufficiently
Yeah.
on that ground.
Right.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Blue jacket.
Okay, I'm sorry.
So I'd like to pick up on something Rabbi Langer mentioned earlier when we were talking about how Germany post-war had really embraced the concept of dealing or owning the Holocaust, and how they incorporated education from the very beginning. So now we have essentially a 70-year reservoir of educating the public and several generations about the implications of fascism. And I want to just contrast that where you said there's a movement, a right-wing movement throughout the world, not just in the United States, that Trump has facilitated, let's say his rhetoric has facilitated. So now we are dealing with a global type of movement to the right, and that you see the same thing developing in Germany as well. And yet they have a very documented 70-year tradition of education. How do you reconcile that this movement is taking place in Germany, which has made that supreme effort to deal with the past, and where do you see it going?
So one of the answers that I've heard, and I don't know enough expertise to give it an absolute answer, is that a lot of this is coming from people from the former East Germany, who don't have as deep a history of post-Holocaust education. And this then fits with what we're seeing in Hungary and Poland, where to the extent that discourse had moved in a positive direction, it's taking a swing way back to your right, so I can gesture that way, in the last couple of years. But it's, there's always going to be disaffected people, individuals. So the question is how many people there are and what the response to them is. So if 200,000 people came out in Berlin, mostly in objection to this kind of discourse, and there was a small number of people otherwise, then that's something very positive, and that's actually what the kind of thing that's happening in Germany. I was in Frankfurt last May, and it was Yom HaKippah. It was Yarmulke Day. And literally the mayor of Frankfurt was standing in a public square on the entrance to the old city, handing out yarmulkes to people saying, will you wear this as you go through town today? Because there had been some anti-Semitic incidents. And this was not unique to Frankfurt, but this is where we actually saw him. So there's proactive things that are happening on the communal level there, where people the leaders of the community are speaking out and saying, no, this is not something that we're going to tolerate.
And if I could throw in a little anecdote, it's not just the leaders. I was on a program a couple of years ago to mark the 500th anniversary of the Reformation of Martin Luther, whose name could be mentioned here, I suppose.
Yes.
Tacking up his theses. And it was at the Morgan Library, and there was a absolutely fabulous exhibit, I don't know if anybody got there, of sort of paintings by Cranach and, all kinds of stuff. And attending this session, this panel that was co-sponsored by the German consulate and all this kind of stuff, was a group of high school gymnasium students from Germany. And so I went in and sat in, and they had a question and answer period with the curator afterwards. And I walked in a little bit late, and they were absolutely raking this guy over the coals. Why? Because there was nothing on Luther's anti-Jewish pamphlets. They didn't have one. And this guy was just like, well, I think it, it wasn't published that much, and there weren't that many things, and it probably went to the Twin Cities and all this kind of stuff. It was an extraordinary thing, but I mean, they were unprompted. It was just that in their education, if you're going to talk about Martin Luther, you have to talk about the Jews and their lies.
The counter to that is that one of the sessions of this conference was actually, just after this, that I went to was about the education of German seminary students, and people talking about the programs that were being developed to teach the German seminary students about Jewish-Christian relations. And the number of students, so there were a couple presentations about, well, here's what we're doing, but then the number of students who were there, and they had brought in about 150 students to attend this conference from all over the country. And the number of students who said, this is the first time we've heard about this, this is not part of our curriculum, it's not a required course, was very high. So it's a problem still.
Yes, ma'am, right over here.
Hi there, my name's Helen Gaston, and I just want to say thank you so much for putting this together. I count these folks among my colleagues, and it's just really, and friends, and it's great to see everybody in this conversation. You all have been conversation partners to me for a long time, so it's a pleasure. I'm curious to put a few other sort of pieces of the puzzle on the table about the historical situation that we find ourselves in. I thought a lot about the pluralism question, or this question of democracy and its prospects in relation to this problem, and really about the difference between the middle decades of the 20th century and the moment we're living in now. And it does occur to me that there are two factors that seem very decisive. The first is media, right? The fact that in those decades, you really do see television as a sort of mode in its infancy. Right, so that the middle decades of the 20th century, like part of the reason that historians have narratives about consensus in those years is that you could go on television and there were like 5 channels, right? I mean, there was no capacity for anybody much who was trying to keep abreast of what was going on the national news channels to get much of a sense to really have a separate media source. So that's one piece of the puzzle. Another piece of the puzzle, it seems to me, and this is something I see with the generation of students that I'm teaching at Harvard, is just the fact that we are, unquestionably in a situation where young people are facing the prospect, no matter how hard they work and whatever jobs they do, of having a standard of living that is less than that of their parents. And that has to do with the incredible and really unprecedented sort of environmental and resource orientation of that particular moment in this nation's history and frankly in world history. And so a set of expectations then from that period of time has been exported as expectations globally. So as a parent of 2 young boys, one thing I find myself doing often is sort of adopting what I think of as almost like a Great Depression mentality and saying to them, instead of asking, where's mine, can you guys try to ask, how can I help? Right, and I find that with my boys, like part of what that does is reframes some of the potential for a sense that that we're getting shafted and someone out there must be responsible for that, right? And so I do think there's a resource basis to this, but I also think that there's a lack of engagement with one another's views, which is partially due to the fact that we can sort of make our own adventure about what's happening in America today, right? And we can literally follow media sources that tell us certain kinds of things about what's happening in America today. So that's a long-winded way to put a question on the table for all of you that you've kind of hinted to in some of your comments, which is just to say that, you know, it's not just the question of the future of democracy, it's the question of whether we actually believe in dialogue anymore. It's the question of whether we actually think pluralism is a useful concept, or whether it's one that just masks inequalities in the dialogue that come to the table and are simply reinforced. I find myself, on the one hand, sympathetic to the frustrations of the younger generation with, as you say, Mark, the idea that we're gonna like have more civil dialogue by like talking about the importance of civil dialogue. The flip side, though, is a little bit the problem that I run into when talking to my father about his 80th birthday. I say, well, Dad, how was your 80th birthday? He says, well, it's fine when you consider the alternatives, right? Which, of course, are not being there for your 80th birthday. And so, from the standpoint of somebody who's of a different generation than my students, I find myself asking, what other alternative do we have, right? Than to try to sit down with one another and talk about the kinds of differences in opinion and communicative strategies that might make it possible for us to resolve some of these questions.
That's an important question. So do you think that pluralism is a virtue that has it inflected this conversation about between Jews and general American culture today, or pluralism in terms of how the American Jewish community, they feel more welcomed, less welcomed, about as welcome as they ever were?
If we don't have pluralism, if we don't have that as a virtue, as a value in our country, then minorities get swallowed up and trampled upon. And the Jewish community is a tiny minority.
What's the official number now, percentage?
Less than 2%.
Less than 2%.
And globally, even less than that, obviously. So if the Jewish community is to persist, then there has to be pluralism, there has to be a way to have multiple voices in the community, to have America be a society which may be run by the best of Christian values, but that those Christian values have to be openness to people of other values as well, and other religious traditions. So I think that I don't see that as a negotiable.
Mark, you're an inveterate reader of polls, I know. Is there any poll on the value of pluralism that's come out from Lilly or Pew or any of this?
Well, I think it's important to think of pluralism as a principle, and plurality as a range of different kinds of people. I think pluralism as a value has taken a hit. Clearly, attitudes towards immigration, including legal immigration, have changed, and this is true. It's true more. It's true in places that have virtually no immigration, like Poland, and it's happened in places that have had a lot of immigration, and we've actually had quite a lot. I think, and I really think that this is an important issue. I try to say it at every occasion. One of the problems out there is that population movements are now increasing because of climate change, and climate change is the 500-pound gorilla in our room, and unless we, I was thinking, that really what I should have said in answer to your 2-minute question was, yeah, I'm going to talk about that, because a lot hinges on how we're able to negotiate, if we possibly can, the next, and you've all read reports of it, not the report itself of the UN. The window is closing fast.
Susannah, do you want?
I would say, of course, I value pluralism very much. I think, though, that pluralism is not only about listening to other points of view, it's also about the kind of mind that's open and how one approaches those other points of view. So one of the dangers, of course, is that, as Browning pointed out in his article, Fox News functions for Trump as Goebbels and the propaganda ministry functioned for Hitler. One of the first things that when the Nazi Party came to power in Thuringia in 1930, Hitler wrote a letter said to advise his people, get control of the educational apparatus. That was the most important thing, not military things, you know, but the educational apparatus. And so there's been an assault for a long time on universities, which are not only about pluralism, but also about training the mind. How do you think? I would just draw one comparison that I personally find interesting, and that's the difference between the ultra-Orthodox Jewish world and the Christian evangelical world. I think for most of us, we want a democracy that's open to many different religious points of views and practices and communities, fine. Ultra-Orthodox Jews, and I have a lot of family who are ultra-Orthodox, let me say, what they want is to be able to live in their own community, make their own rules, and be left alone by the government, apart from, of course, money, financial support. But they want to have their own schools and their own everything, and they're just for them. Whereas Christian evangelicals also want to have a certain kind of religious school and community, etc., but they want it to be for all of America. And I'm struck by that difference. And of course, the rejection on both sides of the idea of engaging in a plurality, let's say, of views. And then my last point would simply be that I worry sometimes that when we have interreligious dialogue, that it's really religious liberals talking to one another. It doesn't matter if they're Christian or Jewish, I'll say they agree. But within the communities, it's hard. That's where it's hard to have religious dialogue between liberals and conservatives.
You know, there's all kind of studies within the Catholic community that show that liberal Catholics have much more in common with liberal Protestants than they have with conservative Catholics. So I think that's true for every brand. Sarah, you had your hand up. Yeah, the green. Yeah, right there.
Moving the embassy to Jerusalem is more than just symbolic. It's the prelude to an undivided capital of Israel, which excludes Palestinians altogether and will be the death knell of the peace plan. Trump has gone well beyond that. He's closed the PLO embassy in Washington. He's cut off all aid to Palestinians. He's tried to block Palestinians from going to the International Criminal Court to prosecute Israeli officials. There's a real war going on against Palestinians, both within Israel and the U.S., and it's overseen by Kushner, Greenblatt, and Friedman, Trump's emissaries. So I'm wondering, it doesn't appear the Jews are very much worse off under Trump's presidency. There may be some emotional damage done, but certainly no financial or physical damage like Palestinians are experiencing. Shouldn't we really be asking what it means to be Palestinian in the age of Trump, especially after the passage of that nation-state law in August in Israel? Then we haven't seen anything quite that bad in the United States yet, and I hope we don't.
That's your next program.
I'm sorry?
I said that's your
That's a
next
good idea.
program.
We'll do something. What is it to be Palestinian in the age of Trump? Yeah. Marcus.
Well, I think you're talking about exacerbating tension rather than making peace, about cruelty to human beings instead of compassion. Go down the line, and this is the kind of trouble that Trump is making all over the world. And who is doing it? Our neighbors put him in office.
Well, yeah, he's getting a lot of support from large financial interests as well. In the Israel lobby has been very much solidly behind him.
Well, yeah, Hobby Lobby and the Koch brothers and so on and so on. I don't think you can say it's simply a Jewish phenomenon, Trump. It's an American
No, you're talking
phenomenon.
about Jewish influence, and it appears to be one of the mainstays of his presidency. Kushner's pulling a lot of strings behind the scenes, and he has his finger in just about he has an unlimited portfolio virtually. So I don't think you people will have to worry too much as long as he's there.
All right.
Yeah.
Yes, sir, right here.
So I have one question that I wanted, first I want to say that thank you for putting this together. I feel so fortunate to be at this panel. It's really fascinating. And as just a side trivia, I went to yeshiva. My yeshiva, which is a elementary religious school for Jewish people, And it's now called the Kushner Academy, just as a piece of trivia.
Where is that?
It's in New Jersey, Livingston. It used to be called the Hebrew Academy of Essex County. I grew up in Newark, yeah. And I'm also Bethlehem. But anyway, my very simple question is this, that, and by the way, all your opinions are so, I appreciate them all, but I have a question for Ms. Heschel about your heritage and your parallel with Germany. So should we be buying tickets to go to New Zealand now? That's one of my questions.
By the way, you know what's really interesting? The #1 destination for migration out of Israel is Berlin,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is fascinating.
Berlin is full of Israelis.
Yeah.
And Germany has a flourishing Jewish intellectual culture.
Mm.
It's remarkable.
Mm.
I would say perhaps we can draw some optimism from that example. Yeah.
So should we be going to New Zealand?
We like
I'm
sheep.
more,
It's very beautiful.
It's a beautiful country, I've been there, I've been there.
South Island.
I have a suitcase packed, so to speak. I'm trying to work out something so that my kids will have a chance to get out if they need to, and I've told them that. So yeah, that's how I feel. Yeah. And I actually see Germany, in fact, of all the European countries, certainly is the most stable, the safest, the place where there are the greatest number of allies. I don't see any other European country protesting the way they have in Germany. It's also interesting, by the way, when you mention Berlin, that the urban centers in Europe and in the United States are the most liberal and the most welcoming of immigrants. It's the people who live in small towns where they've never met anyone other than their, those are the ones that are here supporting Trump or the AfD, the right-wing party in Germany. They've never met, what? But I would also say that although it is East Germany that's of a concern, why would someone in Bavaria? There was just a piece in the Times a few weeks ago. Boy, life is great in Bavaria. It's a very wealthy state. There are almost no immigrants there. Not so long ago, they were welcoming immigrants arriving from Syria. And now, over 10% voted for the AfD. I was afraid it would be much higher. So in some sense, I'm relieved. But nonetheless, you wonder, why? What is the appeal there? What is it? And I don't think the conventional categories that we use to explain political movements really work. It's not about economic issues. It's not about social time. What is it that people find so appealing about this?
I don't have bad stat. I worry a lot about this country, but not as a Jew, but as somebody, a small d Democrat, as somebody concerned about human rights, somebody concerned about truth and fair play and decent social policy. That's what concerns me, and I hope that we stay here and prevail.
Yes, sir.
The topic of the evening is what it means to be Jewish in the age of Trump. So we'll look at it from my own viewpoint, and I find that my values have been devalued. And I'm talking about my values of blue cards that you were raising before. But I find that if there are any values left, they've all been monetized. And you're all both from different campuses. I identify with your father. I had the same question from my son, and I said, you're only as old as you feel, and I felt very young that day. But on the campus, the young people in your campuses, and I think Dartmouth and here and Trinity are all different schools. Do they have the same values that we think we have, or we think they should have? How do they react to this?
Well, that's a book in the writing.
Yeah, for sure.
We have a couple students here.
Yes, let's ask them.
I would just tell you,
I see.
That's a Jewish answer, let somebody else do it.
let me just tell you that the notorious Dartmouth Review, which is very right-wing, did not endorse Trump and opposes him, and that I find interesting.
The discourse on this campus is also very anti-Trump, as far as I've heard.
I assume Brandon.
No? You don't, you're not in your corner?
Sadly not.
Yeah, I think certainly in the theology department.
Oh, I think, yeah, I'm on the staff, but, do you want me to anecdotally
Go
jump
for it.
in?
He
So,
teaches in the sociology department too?
I'm in the sociology department, and I was teaching at the time of the election, of course, on inequality in America. And the AHANA and the lower income student community seems to have found that class. And so the election, and I taught it Tuesday, Thursday, so the election was on Tuesday. And on Thursday, when I came in, I had probably about a third African-American students in a class of about 90. And every one of them wept. And they were reporting things that had happened on the campus on Tuesday night and Wednesday night, language that I will not repeat. But one young woman in the mods, which is a very noisy senior living space, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the adjacent mod were apparently Trump voters, and they were banging on the pipes and screaming in delight. And she just put her head out the window and said, "Hey guys, some of us are trying to sleep." And they used the vilest language to her and, basically said, "Shut up, Trump is president now, it's your time to shut up," right? And, a black student athlete who's a huge guy said, "I can take care of myself," but the black students were arranging that none of them ever walked alone anywhere, from the dorm to the library, from the library to the cafeteria. And he said, "I can take care of myself, but what if 3 or 4 people come at me? What if I need to protect someone else I'm with?" And so that was the conversation. Now, that was a very raw moment. That was, 36 hours after the election results were announced. It's calmer now, but, and I think many, many of our students are humane and caring and, do care about human dignity and the other and being welcome and bearing witness. But there are also some who are not.
Monica, your work at the Boisi here, and you're a very smart sophomore. Do you want to? She's a sophomore here at Boston College. Do you want to?
Yeah, sure. So I guess in my experience here at BC, I feel like even in my political science classes, people are kind of silent. Like, we don't really, there's not a lot of engagement, especially, you bring it up and you kind of try to keep the facts, kind of stick to what is known. You don't want to get into anything too controversial, which I think is kind of ironic. I think everything's kind of controversial at this point. But yeah, like at least in my experience, everyone just kind of, as soon as something is a little touchy, everyone's like, "Ooh, let's step away." And I kind of want to see that change. And even if it's like a point of view that maybe I don't necessarily agree with, I think that people should still express them. I think people should still express them in a civil manner, of course. But I think that the fact that people are, shying away from these conversations, I think that's a concern that I have.
Great. Jorge, do you want to?
Danny at the top is
Are you a student?
yes.
Yeah.
And he's a Jewish student.
Good.
Yeah. So I take on Professor Langer's religious quest class actually. First I want to comment on the talking about the discourse and dissenting opinions or whatever. I agree that in a lot of classes I've seen where people are just hesitant to talk or give different opinions. I'm excited to say that in one class where I haven't seen that, I noticed the professor stepped out now, Father Bernauer, I take a class with him. It's about 20 of us, and there's always different opinions going around in that class. But with the exception of that and a little bit in certain other classes, it's just generally a lot of people are hesitant to say different opinions. And I think, at least for me, that was the case growing up, because anybody who had a different opinion, you were automatically a lot of times shot down. Or nobody wanted to hear it, or they were automatically saying how you were just wrong, terrible. I had, when I was younger in high school, even in high school, so I wasn't that much younger, I was just told, "No, you're just wrong," when I was just expressing a dissenting opinion. Before I even got started, I was 30 seconds in, and I was like, "Well, I don't quite agree with that," and just, so when you get those violent reactions to your opinion, that I think is mainly what's fostering people's quieting down, and then that makes them kind of like a ticking time bomb, and then there will be a point where then they just explode and just say things that maybe not, they're not even necessarily fully developed, but their opinions with some other stuff. So they just explode, but it's just, everybody's wound up tight in today's time, I find. And, but a couple questions I had earlier were, so, like Trump, in a way, I've thought, and I was wondering, is he in some ways good though for the Jewish people? Like, because he actually has a little bit of an investment in making sure that Jews are treated well, and that he actually cares a little bit, as his daughter is converted to Judaism, his son-in-law is Jewish, his grandchild is Jewish, and he's also, the moving the embassy to Jerusalem, though it has been controversial, was an age-old promise that presidents had been saying to do, because Jerusalem is technically the capital. So they kept saying they were going to move the embassy there. And so the fact that he finally did it, even though it's controversial, that he's owning up to that, isn't that in some ways a good thing? And then the second question I had, Professor Langer, if I remember correctly, I think it was you in response to somebody's congregation saying that they supported refugee families from Syria, and you heard of a church actually making the church like an asylum for them to stay in. Even though there has been Muslim Christian hate in the Middle East, it's been a lot less than it has been directed toward the Jews. So isn't it in some ways easier for Protestant churches to make themselves a sanctuary than it is for temples? Because also the anti-Christian hate that you see in the Middle East is generally more against Catholics than it has been against Protestants, at least what I've been seeing. Like, they don't differentiate quite as much, but I feel like that's more, so it's easier for them in some ways.
So do you want to answer either one of those?
Well, in terms of the asylum question, a lot of that has been for the Central and South American refugees. So there we're not dealing with Muslims at all, of course. And the Syrian refugees who get to the United States are, for the most part, not coming across borders illegally. They're coming in through immigration processes. So that's been less of an issue, although not a non-issue. And that the Jewish community has tried to do what it can to address the Syrian immigration, the Syrian refugees. There's been, certainly Israel has been doing in terms of medical help for individuals and providing some resources. And so that there's something there, but you're right that it's hard for Jews to cross the borders into the politically Muslim world, because often an offer of help will be turned down if it's officially coming from a Jewish community. So that's one piece of it. In terms, and yes, of course, Jerusalem, West Jerusalem, not East Jerusalem, but West Jerusalem, is functionally, and by Israel's own declaration, is the capital of Israel. And so there is nowhere else in the world, I think, that a country has a capital and the world doesn't recognize that as the capital. To argue that it's not the capital is to say that we should go back to the partition plan from 1948, which was said that Jerusalem ought to be internationalized and ought to belong to nobody, neither the Palestinians nor the Israelis, and I don't think that that's a realistic prospect either at this point. What exactly the solution is, I don't know, but East Jerusalem is huge, West Jerusalem is huge, and the problems need to be solved. But the embassy, as it's located right now, is close to the border between the two, but it is in West Jerusalem.
Yeah. Just a quick comment on Trump's Jewish family. I think if any other president if that were the case, you would see, some kind of sign of, connection. The president went to a Seder with his children, wears a yarmulke, goes to, that sort of stuff, which, one can take more or less seriously, is the sort of small coin of interfaith stuff in America. Obama and I think he was actually pretty serious about it, Seder's in the White House, because that had been part of his campaign thing, and it was an annual thing, and it was something that, you know, African Americans.
And he enjoyed it.
No, he clearly
Didn't
enjoyed
just
it.
do it.
But, so the question is, why does Trump not do any of that? And I think there are two explanations, and I'm inclined to the first, which, I mean, I'm just gonna list them, which is that he's so awkward religiously that he doesn't know how to do that stuff. The second would be a kind of more malignant explanation, which is he doesn't want to give his sort of racist, anti-Semitic base any opportunity to see him in a yarmulke. But, so there may be some of both. Those aren't mutually exclusive categories. It's just interesting to me that, you know, that Gerald and, you know, Ivanka go back to New York for all the holidays, and that it seems absolutely disconnected from Trump's own life.
Yeah.
I just wanted to clarify, I don't believe that Trump recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital is a gift to the Jews. First of all, I find it troubling that Jews, if there is a claim to Jerusalem, it comes from the Bible. It's a gift from the Bible, from God. So for a religious Jew to say it's from Trump, and thank you, Trump, and let's name the bus stop for Trump, that's a vulgarity that violates, to me, what it is to be a Jew, to Judaism altogether. And then I would say that as long as he continues to fan the flames of enmity and hatred and killing, as long as this goes on, this is not a gift by any means. And to put up an embassy in Jerusalem and then have this horrible war continuing in Gaza and at the border of Gaza, this shooting, this killing, is horrible. And to say it's a great day for peace, this is not a gift to anybody. It's destructive for Palestinians, and it's destructive for Israelis, it's destructive for Jews, and for Christians, and for Americans. It's a terrible thing to do. This only creates terrible suffering and makes peace much harder to achieve. So let's just keep that in mind. There is a gift that comes in a false wrapper. How do you say, yeah?
Please join me in thanking my very smart